Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's episode in our series about the history of freedom with the writer and philosopher Lea Ypi is about the idea of the free market. What is it about buying and selling stuff that makes human beings free? What does the free market free us from? And what does it mean to live in a world of credit and debt for the possibility of human beings ever being free? We haven't talked to this point about what I think a lot of people in the 21st century would think of as a starting point for defining freedom, and that's the free market. But it's not just a 21st century idea, it's a very 20th century idea. It's also a 19th and an 18th century idea. Let's move across those centuries, because the arguments for the free market, weirdly, in some respects, they're quite consistent over time. Some of the things that the defenders of the free market say, they have been saying for a couple of centuries. Some of them are a little bit more contemporary. I just want to run through some of the arguments and get your response to them. And I genuinely don't know what your response to some of them, maybe to all of them, is actually. And there are passionate defenders of the free market, people who are absolutely convinced that there isn't really a plausible account of modern freedom that doesn't start with the idea that free exchange is the basis of it. So some of these ideas are from people like Adam Smith, some from economists like Friedrich Hayek. It doesn't matter that much where they come from. What I want to know is what you think. So here's one. This is, I think, a classic defense of the free market in relation to freedom. And that is that the greatest single enemy to human freedom is extreme poverty. Because if you are very poor, you are extremely vulnerable, not just vulnerable to fate and circumstance and disease, but vulnerable to other human beings. It's much easier to coerce people who lack almost all resources. And also you are incredibly constrained imaginatively, because a subsistence existence is a real grind. I mean, it just is very hard work to be thinking day to day about survival. And from the 18th century on, but I'd say these arguments really gather pace in the 20th century, the idea is that the market, liberal market economies, are the great emancipators of human beings from poverty. So if that is your starting point, maybe it's not sufficient for freedom, but it is necessary for freedom not to be extremely poor. The market is the great liberator.
I want to say something positive and something negative about the market. I guess what I would start with is not this argument to highlight the positives of the market, because it seems to me that, yes, it's true that the market has historically performed this emancipatory, let's call it, function, or lifting people from poverty, but there has also been an extreme violence that has gone hand in hand with the assertion of the free market and with its expansion outside these capitalist, or let's call core commercial societies that we know of in Western Europe. And the cost of that has been the destruction of alternative forms of life. And this is a well-known narrative, which is in some ways embedded also in the free market story in its ideal version. So the idea that you have progressive account of how human beings, social, economic relations develop, starting, which takes its form in different forms of society differently. So you start with hunter-gathering, nomadic societies, then you have agricultural societies, and you have commercial societies as the higher stage that social relations take. And so in the ideal version, it's the concept, and in all the defenses of the free market, you find this account of the superiority of commercial society over these alternative forms of life, which in then the reality, in the kind of assertion of the free market, has gone hand in hand with the suppression of these alternative forms of life. Because exactly, if you have come up with a superior model of social organization, economic and political, why would you then want to retain these alternative forms? So when you can get rid of hunter-gathering, or when you get rid of pastoral or agricultural societies. So it seems to me that, yes, you can make the argument historically that the commercial society, the free market, has lifted people from poverty. But you also need to understand that it has lifted the survivors in a way, those that haven't been annihilated by the expansion of these forms of social organization. And so the cost of that has been the loss of alternative forms of social organization. Now, you might say, well, maybe these alternative forms of social organization didn't do as well with poverty, but then maybe there were other values that they were sustaining and that we are now indifferent to, or that we don't kind of think as much. So if I were to start with the defense of the free market, I wouldn't necessarily start with the one that says, well, this is a superior form of socio-economic organization, because it seems to me that the violence on which that is premised historically doesn't quite make up for the cost of it is so high that in the end, yeah, you can say a lot about the benefits, but it's still, there's this fundamental original sin in a way.
So just before we come to your defense, so on that argument, that's the long-term view. It can be an account of human development through these various stages. There is also a contemporary version of it, which is much, much more condensed, which is the great emancipation of human beings from poverty has taken place in the last 30 to 40 years. And it's remarkable. And we're talking about billions of people. And yes, we are talking about the eradication of certain ways of life because there is a uniformity to the market as it spreads around the world. And we are living in a globalized world, which is also in some respects a more uniform world. But the dramatic, condensed version of that in our lifetimes, literally in our lifetimes, in places like Africa, but particularly in India and in China, maybe particularly in India because it's been so recent. Do you still feel the same argument holds that in the last 30 years we've seen the eradication of the diversity of the human experience?
So I accept that, but then we would have to have a more specific argument maybe about what it is about India and China that has actually lifted people from poverty, because it seems to me that we are not there confronted with the purest market form and that we are not confronted with free market societies, that in fact these are models that to some extent depart from the textbook idea of what it means to have a free market that is deregulated without political institutions, without control from above, and that it seems to me that what you have historically is something very, very different. And that if you look at the statistics and then you take away India and China as these hybrid models, then you are left with a much more ambiguous record on poverty development. That's one aspect of it. The second one, I guess, one also needs to talk about when thinking about the advantages of the free market is not just poverty, but also inequality. And on that front, humanity, if even in this kind of large scale, big modeling, it's not improving. And you might say, yes, absolute poverty is a concern, but in the times in which we live, where the world is very interconnected, relative deprivation and comparisons and inequality is also a very high concern as well. And on that front, it doesn't seem that the free market is kind of helping us. But this is now getting on the pathologies and the criticism. If I were to say, what is it about the free market? What is it about commercial societies that is to some extent a benefit and that you start from? And it seems to me that it's the kind of emancipation from traditional forms of social organization that are genuinely suppressing of autonomy. And with the rise of commercial society, it goes hand in hand, it seems to me, with the assertion of a certain kind of subjects and certain understanding of who the human is and how you account for the human, what kind of claims they have against others, how do they relate to other people. That is, to me, genuinely promising when it comes to freedom, because it's a departure from a type of understanding of the subject as defined by the community, by the family, by social norms, by other kind of collective rules. And it seems to me that commercial society goes hand in hand with the assertion of, for better or worse, but it seems to me that it is a step forward in the sense of the departure from these forms of authoritarian social organization.
And that is an argument that was made in the 18th century and in the 19th century. So there are sort of phrases associated with it, from status to contract is one. Status-based relationships are potentially at least more domineering than contract-based relationships. Another word that's associated with it is civility. So the thing about the market is these are, I don't think there's a better word from this than anonymous relationships. There is a neutrality in the ideal market, but also in practice, I think, in many sets of market relationships, in which in seeking out the best price or the best service or whatever it is, you don't have to start with the question, who am I allowed to do this with? Nor the even more difficult question, which is, will the person I have to do it with let me do it? That is civility, being a kind of servant. And most human relationships pre what we might call modern commercial societies were based on understandings that someone was in that relationship relative to someone else. Within the family, the children, the wife, the servants, literally, 17th, 18th century families included the servants. If you were a servant and you wanted to seek out a particular good for your life, you had to pass through a whole host of barriers of permission before you can do it. A free market is the great leveler of those barriers.
Also something else which oddly goes, I think, against what is the received common sense about the type of individual that the free market relies upon, which is often assumed to be profit maximizing, selfish, interested only in themselves. And it seems to me that the most interesting arguments for the free market, or let's call it commercial society, because it's a more expansive term, are the ones that say that by entering into commerce, into commercial interactions with others, individuals actually expand their circle of sympathy. So they are able to move away from the family, from the people they share a religion with, or they share certain types of belief. And because they have this kind of expansive nature, then you understand that the human is actually not someone who stands against others, but who is potentially cooperative. And I think it's really interesting because someone like Adam Smith, for example, makes these kinds of arguments around sympathy and around the expanding circles of sympathy. And he's usually seen as a sort of paradigmatic example of the defense of the free market. But I think with a notion of the subject at the center that is very, very different from what now the stereotypical understanding of the champions of the free market is, which is that you have to be indifferent and you have to not care and so on. I think for people like Smith, to some extent for Kant as well, all these arguments in the 18th century around commercial society are really interesting precisely because they highlight the cooperative nature of humans rather than the antagonistic nature. I mean, it starts with antagonism, but the idea is that you enter in these relations and they somehow emancipate you. They make you more forward-looking and more altruistic and more better disposed towards others. And I really like that.
One of the things that people noticed about commercial societies, I think particularly in the 19th century, particularly in places like Great Britain, the people who weren't the radical critics of them, is they allowed for a flourishing of varieties of human association. So actually, earlier forms of society were quite constrained in the imagination of what it is to do something as a group, a family, a tribe, a clan, whatever it is, based on the land, tied in various ways. And in the 19th century and the early 20th century, you get this incredible flourishing of the varieties of human association under the law. You can join with other human beings in incredible ways if you share not relations of civility or of power, but a common purpose, something that you want to do. It's not purely selfish because you want to do it with other people, but you might want to then draw other people in by offering them the service, whatever it is. And that's, I think, one of the things that has been lost. So as you move through this story into the later 20th century, into the 21st century, certain kinds of economic forms of association have come to dominate, particularly corporate forms in the economic and financial sphere. And there was a dream that lies somewhere between sort of Adam Smith and now, which is maybe 100 years old, but it still has some draw, which is this is the way, this kind of free association and free exchange is the way for human beings, like you said, to find other human beings. And then outside of the family, outside of the church, a religious setting, in extraordinary experimental ways, discover what they're capable of.
Yeah, I think that's right. But then I wonder whether that's how it was because it was the beginning and because these were the origins. And then as this model takes over and becomes more entrenched and more consolidated, the types of pathologies become more and more prominent. And then you begin to see also the downside of this spontaneity and these forms of social organization that are in some ways against authority and against tradition and define themselves against them. And I think you also begin to see then the impact that they have on places and parts of even, not just the world, but even Europe, which are not run according to those models, at which then suddenly feel the impact. I mean, I come from Albania, which was under the Ottoman Empire for many centuries. And for me, the history of the Ottoman Empire, for example, begins to decline partly under the pressure of commercial society and of alternative forms of social organization, which by virtue of how it was arranged, it couldn't withstand. It couldn't withstand this pressure. It couldn't compete with. And the Habsburgs, to some extent, also was similar. So, yes, I think you get the flourishing in some parts of Europe, but you get the destruction in other parts of Europe of those models of society that are not really able, and lawmaking and institutional organization that I think aren't quite able to compete with those commercial societies.
And I know there are arguments that say this isn't what I just described is not actually a distinctive feature of free market or commercial societies. There are views that the Byzantine Empire or the Ottoman Empire, that various empires have periods of incredible flourishing of varieties of human association, but then it becomes ossified and stale and power relations assert themselves and certain types of human association come to dominate. And then it's very, very hard to break free. And the history of free market capitalism may be just another version of that. So you can find the periods where it looks like it's the answer to the question of the diversity of human flourishing, which is what the defenders of the free market have always said. When you look at the 21st century version, it's not clear that that is true. There's an awful lot of diversity, but there's also an awful lot of uniformity.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe that is part of the trajectory of all of these forms of social organization, right?
And all stories of freedom, maybe. So I want to give you another argument that, again, you hear it in different forms from the 18th century onwards about the free market. One of the challenges for human freedom is that all human societies are going to have within them people who have an awful lot of power, often money and power, and have no real incentive to obey the rules. And they will behave like bandits. That's a word that's often used of them, the powerful bandits, the robbers, who will get rich by taking what they can take. Goes a bit back to Plato, what people will get away with. They get away with what they will get away with. And the great advantage of a free market society is its organizing principle is the rule of law, which is, broadly speaking, very broadly speaking, neutral. And there's a moral argument for that. It treats people fairly. You can agree or disagree, and I suspect there are lots of reasons to disagree with that. But there's a pragmatic argument, a prudential argument, which is it encourages the people who might otherwise be bandits to play by the rules. Why does it encourage them? Because they spot they'll get richer playing by the rules. And even if the rules then get warped by their power, it's still better to have them inside the tent. So you can at least try and hold them to the law than a genuine bandit economy where when they come for your goods, there's nothing that you can do. And that is an 18th century argument. It's also a 21st century argument in a way. There are robber bandits out there. There are societies in which the oligarchs can more or less take what they want, not quite, but almost. And then there are societies maybe like somewhere like Great Britain, where there are very wealthy, powerful people, but there is a plausible case that they are constrained by rules that they have signed up to because those rules are the basis of their wealth.
That seems to me to be sort of ideology in a way, just a narrative of how everyone is equal in the market. It's premised on the idea that individuals all have equal bargaining power, that they're all positioned equally in front of the law, and therefore any one of them who takes risks, does these things, engages with other people in the way in which the rules of commercial society prescribe, will then potentially benefit, and therefore you can then see this story of advancement and so on. But that's the bit of free market thinking that strikes me as pure ideology in a way, because if you actually look...
And by ideology, do you mean fantasy?
No, not fantasy, a kind of narrative that justifies a model and that then takes hold on people's minds who then buy into the model and then who absorb the costs and are willing to justify the excesses because they think, well, the narrative seems like the right one. It's a little bit like the story of we're all equal in front of the law in the state. Well, that's not the case, right? So some of us have more means than others. And so in the case of the free market, if you are someone who has capital and has resources or has land or basically owns a lot of stuff, they don't have the same bargaining power in the market with someone who doesn't have anything else and just shows up and says, here's what I can do. And that's me. And that's all I have is myself. So in a way, these asymmetries of wealth and property and capital and so on, it seems to me they undermine this narrative that in the market everyone is equal. Yes, they are equal in the abstract, and yes, for the contract, to the eyes of the law and for all intents and purposes when it comes to making contracts, they're equal. But actually, the agents who are signing a contract de facto are not equal. And indeed, often contracts end up advantaging those who have more resources and who can drive the agenda and so on. So it seems to me that that's the bit of actually that I've always found really perplexing. And I'm surprised that more people don't see it in generally kind of free market oriented societies, that this is just a narrative that takes hold and everyone believes in it. And then therefore they somehow suspend their criticism of the law, of these structures, of the way in which contracts are signed.
So I think the argument I was making, there is an ideal version of it, which is close to the one you've described, which I think is pretty implausible, equal bargaining power. And then the pragmatic one, which is a much, much more modest argument, which is there are lots of scenarios in which if you have raw structures of power and hierarchy and massive inequalities of wealth, there is no bargaining power. So the bandit version of it, your money or your life version of it, that's not, your money or your life is not a bargaining position for the person on the other side of the table. It's a threat. It's extraction. The word that sometimes uses, these are extractive societies in which the people with the power use that power to augment their wealth, and then they use that wealth to augment their power. And yes, you're not going to get equality under the law except in the ideal or idealized version of this. But there is some bargaining power within this. So even in the very unequal societies like the ones that we live in, it's not just banditry. What it is a structure organized around rules in which you will need resources to know how to navigate those rules. And it's going to be very unequal. The people with the money can buy the lawyers, and the people without the money can't often afford the lawyers, and so on and so on. So there's nothing idealized about it. But it's better than banditry. And banditry is often the default condition of very unequal societies.
I'm going to kind of push the alternative argument. I mean, again, it seems to me that the difference between a state and a bandit organization is just how we justify the state and how we justify the bandit organization, right? But it seems to me that if you think that the state is basically just the strong and the powerful who have managed to accumulate and concentrate power and now hold monopoly over violence and then can impose their will on others, well, that's just like a form of bandit organization, right? On a larger scale, in some ways, you'd say it's even worse than a bandit organization that might be smaller and might be less devastating. And
bandits plus rules is worse than bandits without rules.
I mean, yeah, imagine a kind of bandit organization with nuclear weapons, right?
Well, there are some.
So most of them are, if you think of the state in a certain way. So this is why I say ideology is important, because on the basis of that ideology, that you then justify the state and think about how it's made acceptable and how people subscribe to the rules.
I want to come on to another defense of the free market, but just on this, faced with the argument that the rule of law, which has at its heart an idea that it will treat people equally or neutrally. It doesn't in practice, but that idea is there. And so when you live in an organization that has an ideal to which it does not live up, there are some advantages to that. Even ruthless, brutal dictators can be held to account in part by their hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is one of the things that lets people be reined in because you are the victim of your own pretense. If you think of the rule of law in that light, it is the hypocrisy of free market societies to talk about the rule of law. Just as, a classic example of this was during the Cold War, when the Soviet regime signed up to arms treaties that it had no intention of upholding. Nonetheless, there is something that you can do with people by saying, this paper's got your signature on it. You can shame hypocrites. Do you not see any of the pull of that?
Yeah, but then this idea that we have treaties and we have laws and we subscribe, this is a very old idea. So I don't really see that we can credit the free market with this. It seems to me that this has been going on. Principle of pacta sunt servanda, it precedes the emergence of kind of free market capitalism or free market societies, commercial societies. So I'd say, yes, there is something, but it might work the other way around as well, right? It's because you have this idea that you then enforce certain types of market interactions.
But doesn't it democratize it to the extent that, yes, there's always been the thought that treaties can be binding even if the people who sign them don't mean to abide by them. But that's an elite practice. It's not the case in most societies that ordinary people can hold a piece of paper and say, you signed this. But that is true under various versions of free exchange in the rule of law. It is, it's a very contract-oriented set of arrangements. And so you have kind of passed the opportunities to hold people up by their failing to meet their own hypocritical standards down the chain.
I can see that, but then I guess there you have two narratives of what accounts for the emergence of this type of principle that expands somehow the range of who you can make certain demands on and so on. And while I think it's true that the emergence of these commercial societies did play a role in the rule of law and so on, I don't think it was necessarily what accounted for democracy. It seems to me that the movements that democratized, that tried to open up the public sphere, were often also movements that weren't necessarily free market movements. So the democratizing movements of the 18th, 19th century in particular, were also movements that tried to resist the free market, and indeed were doing so on the basis of the idea that it wasn't just for the property holders and it wasn't just for people who owned assets. And so I wouldn't credit the defense of commercial society with also having come up with mechanism for holding people accountable that actually works.
So here's another argument for the free market I'm going to run by you. So this one I would associate particularly with Friedrich Hayek, the 20th century Nobel Prize winning, maybe one should say, economist, although when he won the Nobel Prize...
Alongside Murdoch.
Alongside all sorts of people. His Nobel Prize winning acceptance speech is worth reading because he says, I'm happy to take this prize, but my God, economists think they're more important than they really are. And part of the reason he thought that was he believed his view of the free market was a theory of knowledge, essentially. And the great threat to human freedom, he believed, and he thought he took this view from 19th century liberals like Tocqueville and others, is you need to be emancipated from false prophets. People who have false prophecies of the future, I mean, all prophecies in a sense are of the future, but specifically secular ones, around how the economy could be structured, politicians, particularly in democratic societies, who are going to try and present, in order to secure their power, a version of the future. If hypocrisy can emancipate you in some ways, Hayek believed prophecy traps you because all of us, all human beings, we all do it, right? You make a prediction, and then even if it's not coming true, you kind of double down on it in order to try and save face. And he genuinely believed that the way power worked in modern societies, the real risk was politicians who would offer plans for the economy, offer a prospectus of full employment, whatever it is, control prices, mid-20th century political offers, that these were the things that would ultimately trap human beings in patterns of behavior from which they couldn't escape because the people with power would be committed to saving face by pushing further and further. And the further you push on these plans, the less human freedom there will be because more and more constraint is needed. The market is the emancipator because the market is the thing that exposes the false prophecies, because the market knows things that no human being and no group of human beings know, which is the value of goods. It sets the price. And the price mechanism is the vehicle of human freedom because the enemy of human freedom are all the different human beings who think they can set the price. I actually think that is quite a plausible argument.
I also think it's a very important and very strong argument. Also have a lot of time for it, also as part of a kind of theory of knowledge and of how order forms and so on. I guess for me, when you're thinking about that and the alternatives or that and the criticism, the question is a question of how do you reckon with the costs of it, with the cost of that view vis-a-vis the cost of the, let's call it the planning view, for want of a better distinction. And it seems to me that Hayek doesn't deny that there is a cost to the free market view. And he just doesn't think that want, need, despair, poverty are also genuine impediments to freedom. So somehow he has a conception of freedom that is not broad enough that it can allow for us to understand that if someone is desperate, if someone is homeless, if someone is hungry, they are unfree. His conception of freedom doesn't enable him to do that. And therefore he can say, well, markets, free markets enable us to innovate and we don't have control over the direction of society. And if there are these victims along the way, well, tant pis, that's so be it. That's what happens. And indeed, he thinks social justice as a result of that is a mirage. He calls it the mirage of social justice. He doesn't think that any institution is or should be in the business of trying to somehow do something about the victims of the market. What I really like about Hayekian view is the honesty about all of this, which is not honesty that you would find in any other, I think, or you'd not find it very often in a lot of free market advocates, because they usually present it as though, well, no, you can do something about it. Whereas what I like about Hayek is that it gives you this kind of stark choice. Okay, if you want to do the free market route, you will understand that there will be losers and there's nothing you can do about the losers. It's just a cost that we have to absorb if we want flourishing societies of this type. Now, I'm not someone who is happy to absorb the costs, because I think to the person who is left behind, to the poor, to the homeless, it matters. It is their one life, and it matters what happens to them depending on what kind of choices we make and how we design institutions and society. So if I'm going to lose a little bit of innovation or a little bit of the direction because I'm planning more and save more of the victims of the free market, then I'm prepared to drive on that motorway rather than on this one, and absorb the costs of that one rather than this one, the Hayekian one. But I find the argument plausible, and I think it is a kind of genuine and interesting debate how you think about it. The second thing that I also really like, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is the argument around prices and planning, and which is obviously, having lived in communist Albania, you could really experience this. You could really see what is the cost of central planning economy, where you don't have signaling and you just see queues forming because you don't have an adequate supply and demand mechanism, and because it doesn't work in the right way. What I'm really interested in recently is all the arguments for techno-utopians who say that in the age of AI and digital revolutions, there are now ways in which we can have much better within controlled or more controlled economies. You have much better signaling and you have a much faster communication between the kind of chains of economic distribution that enables you to then have a better oversight than you might have had when Hayek was writing. And so I'm really interested in these arguments that say, okay, this was a genuine issue, but now there are technological possibilities to overcome some of the objections that are made to the planning.
I'm also interested in that, but actually on that, I'm probably most suspicious of all, because the argument for the market is that the market knows things that no human being knows, no group of human beings know. The market has its own knowledge, which comes from this accumulation of all of the interactions of human beings. And you see this repeated across the internet in different forms. Google knows things that no human being and no group of human beings and the people who run Google don't know, and the people who designed Google don't know. And these new AIs, they have this sort of black box quality to them that the market has. The market is a black box. You design the rules of the market, but it'll produce answers to the question, what is the value of this good? That not only can no one predict, but no one actually quite knows how it does it. How does it know this? And these really sophisticated AIs are doing things and coming up with answers that no one can know. But then I want to know who owns those things, because it's an extraordinary power. And okay, you could say it's the same question with the market. Who owns the market? But it seems to me it's a more acute question in the age of AI, that actually you have these corporate forms, these winners in a market system, that are now acquiring a whole extra level of power, which is they control, they build, they own the machines which are the new knowers of the things that no human being knows. It's more threatening than the market version because the power is more concentrated.
Yeah, I don't know, because it seems to me that in the market version, in the development of the market, historically we have gone towards more and more monopolization of capital and more concentrations of power. And so in that sense, I wouldn't say that, the kind of digital innovations are responsible for the concentration of power and concentration of ownership around these digital platforms. They are just the form that capital takes at this particular stage. In this case, it happens to be digital. And so that's why Google and Microsoft and all these big platforms. But it's a general feature of the way in which wealth is accumulated and concentrated in the society in which we live.
But I'm more thinking of the concentration of the knowledge of the things, the signals that human beings can't access for themselves. There is that concentration now too within these systems.
But that's because we live in societies where everything is commodified. And so knowledge is a commodity as well. And that's why it's not surprising that you have this concentration. So then the question is, you kind of take it back and say, okay, what can we do? I agree with you. It's very concerning that there is this degree of control over knowledge. But what can we do to distribute control more widely? And then you go back to the dilemma of, is the market really as open and as inclusive as it's said to be? Or is it, in fact, just a few elites that end up concentrating wealth and therefore controlling more of the economy? And how can you then open that up? And then it becomes a question of how you democratize the economy more widely.
I would also say against the Hayekian view, so this is the critic of the false prophecies of those politicians who claim to know the future. I think faith in the free market is itself a false prophecy. And actually, we know that now. So we know that there are circumstances in modern societies in which you do need to radically restrain the power of the market because you've hit a problem, particularly within a specific time frame, where you do not have the time to allow the market to work its magic. And if you do allow the market to work its magic in that short time frame, there will be so many losers that politics will take over in a different way. And, so the 1930s might be an example of this, the Great Depression. Yes, in the long run, let the banks fail, and in the end, the price mechanism will let us know what the future really holds. But in the short run, you're going to get fascism and all the rest of it. A challenge like climate change seems to me similar. There are lots of Hayekians who say that clearly the solution to all human problems is to let the market's price mechanism signal to us what will work. And if we try and guess now what we need in 30 years' time, we're going to get it wrong. We'll be trapped with our guesses. We will end up, wasting a fortune trying to prove we were right, and the world will get warmer. But you can imagine circumstances in a warming world in which the political consequences of letting the market work its magic actually produce a vicious circle effect, in which we start reacting to the losses that we suffer while we're waiting for the market to work its magic, and we find political solutions that are far worse. So I actually think, and it is a faith, all of these things are a faith, there is a free market religion out there, and Hayek is its high priest. And given that he's the critic of false prophets, I think it's dangerous.
I suppose what Hayek would say, there's a difference between the impersonal and the personal. And so if I were to defend Hayek's position, I would say, well, yes, it is a faith and it is a religion, but there is a difference between putting your faith in people and putting your faith in processes, and in processes that are impersonal. Now, my objection to that would be that these processes are actually not impersonal in the end, because the way in which markets have developed, the way in which the types of societies that we live in, there are always personal forces also behind what seems like impersonal forces. It may be more complicated, it's more widely spread, it's not vertical, it's horizontal, but there is a type of oppression, there is a type of injustice that is structural, what we call structural, which is not personal. And so I guess this is where the debate then would be, to say, okay, but is an oppression or a type of injustice where you can put a face and where you can say it's politicians, it's the technocrats, it's the decision makers, the same as a type of oppression where the oppression is created by the little contributions of all these people who are actually just going about their business and might also do something good. So that's, I think, where the interesting debate is.
And I think I would say the belief that you should put your trust in processes over people cannot be a universal principle, because there are clear moments in history where it's better to put your trust in people than processes. So America in the 1930s, which could have gone down many different paths, it, by luck more than by design, gets a president, Franklin Roosevelt, who is in no way a systematizer, doesn't really understand the economics, reads a bit of Keynes, presumably a bit of Hayek, bit of this, bit of that, is constantly feeling his way, has the right temperament to experiment in ways where the signals that he's trying to pick up are the political signals. What will people tolerate? Because there was a real risk that American democracy would collapse into some version of dictatorial or even fascistic politics. And it does make sense to me that there are points in human history where faith in impersonal processes, because people are fallible, is a mistake. This is my problem with cryptocurrency. It's madness, right? To think that what you want is a money that's completely incorruptible by human input. I want a money that's corruptible by human input when we need money to be corrupted by human input. Otherwise, we're all going to die. You got nothing to say to that?
Nothing to say on that.
Okay, good. I want, for once, it's the first time in this series where I've silenced you. Okay, two more things. One other feature of market economies, commercial societies, and we talked about this a bit last time in relation to Kant and Kant's view about what we needed to be emancipated from to achieve perpetual peace, is that the medium of exchange is money. This is a moneyed world. Not all worlds are moneyed worlds. The ancient world, in lots of respects, was not really a money world. The world of money, particularly the more recent versions of it, basically what we're talking about is credit and debt. I mean, money is just a ledger of who owes what to whom, and indeed cryptocurrencies are a ledger of who owes what to whom. Many critics in different ways of commercial societies have thought that in emancipating people from relations of civility, what you create are new kinds of relations of civility, because the creditor-debtor relation is a power relation. It can go both ways. There's that old argument that if you owe someone £50,000, that person controls you. But if you owe them £50 million, you control them, because they really need you to, be good for your debts. And then on the international scale, with modern finance, modern banking, it's beyond human imagining how much the United States of America owes to its creditors. And there's no escape from it. There feels like there's no escape from a world which is entirely mediated by credit-debt relationships. Personal debt is massive across the developed world, particularly. Government debt is massive across the developed world. There's huge power in the banks, who are the creditors, but also some of the banks are extremely vulnerable because they've lent so much. And that feels like, to me, like it puts a real dampener on the argument that this is the vehicle of human freedom. We have, as a result of embracing a free market way of existence, created a mind-boggling network of creditor-debtor relations, which do not make human freedom easily visible in this.
Yeah, and for me, that I completely agree with that, and that there is an even sort of an added harm, which is the harm of war. And in some of the theories of why are there wars between states in the world, that's all to do with this type of dynamic of creditor and debt relations. And all the kind of old traditional accounts of imperialism, for example, stem from this argument that there was a belief that the credit and debit system would supply the money that is needed to cater to the demands of workers in particular states, or to create a kind of welfare subsidies and so on. All of that comes to haunt you because, in fact, it's premised on the exploitation and the plundering of other parts of the world to create a base that can sustain these types of relations, the dominating relations in the international sphere. And so what seems to us an escape valve within particular societies, within particular economies, that gives, the states can borrow and therefore they can then have also certain social expenditures, will always come to haunt the most vulnerable states in the world economy, where someone will always have to pay the price of those kinds of creditor and debt relations, whether in the form of old imperialism and old conquest and so on, or in the form of now debt dependency and neo-colonial dynamics of conditioning other more poor, more vulnerable countries, where you really see that operating in the international institutions in the way in which countries who go bankrupt are not the United States become effectively dominated by more powerful states and exploited and then used for the advancement of those companies that are based in these kind of stronger states. So for me, what's really, in a way, even more depressing about it is that, going back to your argument about perpetual peace and this world of free republican states that federate with each other and cooperate and on a peaceful relations, exactly this creditor and debtor dynamic shows and explains why that can't be the case for as long as these societies are run on free market principles.
And Hayek is one of those people who himself was very worried that one path that his version of freedom could take was towards an excessive reliance on these sort of cheap remedies for the challenges that are faced. In the 20th century, he was a 19th century liberal who believed in really strict constitutional restraints on the capacity of governments to borrow, because he knew it was the path of least resistance. It is the path of least resistance. We know you can tax, you can steal, or you can borrow. And we know that borrowing is the easiest, partly because it puts off the obligation and partly just because it causes less fuss. And therefore he thought, actually, freedom in his sense required strict liberal constraints on government, so strong separation of powers, budget limits and all the rest of it, the kind of arguments that's going on in the United States now.
Which is kind of, so all of this is bad enough if you're Britain. Imagine how much worse it is if you're Albania or Argentina or some, it's because if you're in the periphery of the core of these economies, then you are much more vulnerable to the pressures of the international market. And then even the mechanisms that the wealthy countries have to actually look after their own vulnerable citizens are really not available to these other states.
And I'd say the other problem with being a 19th century liberal in the 20th or the 21st centuries is it's not the 19th century, right? So say in the United States of America now, you want to introduce these strict constraints which limit the power of politicians to inflate the currency or to borrow more to get over this crisis or that crisis. You demand in a Hayekian way to go back to the gold standard or to introduce Bitcoin as the currency so that politicians can't interfere with it. And therefore you bind the hands of the politicians, right? But you're binding them under conditions that are far more dangerous because of the weight of obligations that are built up over time. So America goes bust and we're all screwed. now, certainly. It may not have been true 200 years ago, but it's certainly true now. So you're really playing with fire, I think, if you do that kind of 19th century liberalism in the 21st century, because the stakes are too high.
Yeah, no, that's right. Although I'm more open, I guess, to the productive ruptures. So.
Do you want the debt ceiling to be breached and America to renege on its debt?
America goes bankrupt. I think I'm open to the productive scenario that might unfold as a result of that.
Last thing, which is another of the criticisms of the free market, and you've touched on it, of commercial society. You've more or less just made this case, but I want to really draw it out. It is always easy to identify the places where it really seems to have worked. So, for instance, there I was talking about, let's take 19th century Britain. Some terrible stuff happened in 19th century Britain, and some of the results of a more liberalized market economy were terrible working conditions for people, and it required politics to rescue children and other people from this kind of exploitation. But nonetheless, across the 19th century into the 20th century, incredible advances in life expectancy, eventually in health outcomes, in education, in general well-being, including basic measures of GDP. It becomes a richer country. These riches are more widely distributed. Terrible stuff, but good stuff too. But all of it is happening because there's an empire underneath it. And so someone, not a radical Marxist by any means, but someone as unillusioned in his way as George Orwell, one of his arguments about Britain was that it was just completely in denial about the basis of its own wealth. And much of what its politics was, which was a sort of playing around with the structures of distribution within its own borders, was a kind of fantasy based on the fact that no one wanted to talk about the empire that underpinned it. And maybe you see that repeated in all of the success stories of the free market. There is always an external factor, which is the thing outside where some version of banditry is taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that both at the macro level with the nations and the states, and you also see it at the micro level with the idea of the kind of successful entrepreneur or the person who made it, and where you actually go and look at the cases. It's very rarely that the person who made it really started from nothing. And in fact, often it is sheer good fortune and family wealth. And then you look at the roots and how this family wealth was accumulated, and there's always also not always clean money at the bottom of it all. So it seems to me that this is going back to where we started about the effects of ideology. So all of these factors are suppressed in our account of the rewards of free individual initiative and creativity and innovation. And in fact, when you kind of scratch the surface, you realize that in every process of accumulation, the basis of it, both individual process of accumulation and collective process of accumulation, the basis of it really is violence. And so the question is, how much violence are you willing to justify to then uphold the benefits that follow?
And another version of that argument, the strongest defenders of the free market in the world today live in Silicon Valley in California, and they have imbibed Hayek and other 20th century economists and Ayn Rand and the novelists of the emancipated market man, and it is always a man, and these people are almost always men. And they have not just an ideology, but a myth about themselves, which is that they are self-made. And so some of them have advantaged backgrounds, but really what they are building their wealth on is the violence of the state, because this technology, we know now, and that this has been so well documented as almost to have become a cliche, this technology is the product of the American military industrial state bureaucratic complex. And it's a Second World War and a Cold War set of imperatives, and spending on a mind-boggling scale of public money that created the platform on which the wealth of the apostles of the free market has been built.
Yeah, and I think what's also really interesting there is that we never challenge what the foundations of private property are, because all of these models are premised on the acceptance of a certain way of relating the individual to the external resources that they happen to find themselves in. And all of that requires a good story of what justifies accumulation, what justifies that, this is not yours and then it becomes yours. I think one of the ways in which one can really fundamentally challenge the models in Silicon Valley and so on is to just ask people, what is it that you think makes this yours? And there are so many different accounts there. And I think most of them are implausible, but maybe that's for another time.
Our fortnightly newsletter comes out tomorrow, and tomorrow's edition accompanies this series. It's full of writing, clips, links about some of the ideas of freedom that we've been talking about. To get it, you just need to click on the link in the show description. You can also find out there how to sign up to PPF Plus to get bonus episodes and ad-free listening. As we mentioned before, the last newsletter we discovered did end up in some subscribers' junk or spam folders. We have been working to try and make sure that doesn't happen again, but just to be safe, if your newsletter doesn't arrive, do check junk or spam, and if you can, do mark the newsletter for your main inbox. Do also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at PPF Ideas, where you can see video clips from this series. Our next episode is about anarchism and nihilism. What does it mean to believe in freedom if you don't really believe in anything else? This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.